Good afternoon to everybody. Good mornings if you're on the West Coast with us. I was excited to hear from Stephanie that we had kind of a record registration numbers for this webinar. And I'll be excited to get some feedback afterwards to see what everybody thought about the approach that we're taking here to kind of uncloaking, demystifying, if you will, NENA standards a bit. And we're going to go very foundational today. And then we're going to build on that foundation in future webinars. So hope everybody enjoys the information. And I want to encourage a good conversation in the chat. Looks like everybody's checking in, saying hello, and that's great. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Stephanie will be monitoring those, and we'll do our best to cover what we can. And if you've got any thoughts about questions in the chat, feel free to respond there. I know I looked at the list of attendees already, and I see some NENA standard experts in their own rights. And so we're glad everybody's here and want to encourage that participation today. I'll start by giving an introduction to myself. The other thing that Stephanie said is that we have a truly international webinar audience today. We have some fresh registrants from Canada, from Dominican Republic, I think you said Puerto Rico maybe, as well as from parts of the US that we haven't got a lot of coverage from in the past. So I'll give a brief introduction to myself here. I have been working with GIS technologies for the last 25 years or so, in particular at the intersection of GIS and public safety since 2009, and it 911 and public safety operational GIS has become a passion at that point. So I've always counted it a privilege to be able to have a part in impacting the people that help save lives every day, and it is something that is a passion of mine. And so I'm glad that we're here and able to talk about it today. I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off so that there's not any bandwidth issues sharing out my screen. And in case you're not familiar with DataMark and what we do, just very briefly, we're the public safety GIS experts. We focus in public safety GIS for addressing, for road center lines, for 911, even for operational law, fire, and EMS responders as it relates to CAD, call handling, and any other system that may take in spatial data at any point in its life cycle. We also have stood up an expert team of indoor mapping experts as well recently, and we have a suite of products that works with all of those purposes, and we pride ourselves really on being able to serve the needs of the public safety GIS community. So let's get into our webinar a little bit today. You know, I don't know what everybody expected to see based on some of the feedback we got on our sign-up form. It seems like some of you may be looking for some how to meet NENA standards, in particular detail about GIS stuff. But today we wanted to take a step back and take our lens to the 35,000 foot level and examine what how NENA standards are made and why that impacts what we do with those standards. So we're going to talk very briefly about processes, outputs, and impacts from that effort that NENA puts together in order to deliver standards, information documents, and requirement documents. And we'll get into what is the difference between a standard and an information document or a requirement document. Why do I need to care about one over the other, and at what point is it relevant to my life as a GIS practitioner supporting public safety? And for that matter, why is it important even from an operational public safety or PSAP or first responder perspective as well? So again, I want to encourage everybody, if you have questions or comments about any of the things, Stephanie will be monitoring the chat. Please be sure to participate in that discussion. So if you've never heard of the NENA Development Group, or you haven't realized that you have heard about it, If you're a part of any of the working group activities that NENA puts together, you're a part of the NENA Development Group. It's the name of the group that is charged with running an organized, responsive approach to developing standards, information, and requirements documents. These documents are at the core of NENA's mission. NENA itself is an ANSI certified, that's American National Standards Institute, an ANSI accredited standards making body, or SDO, standards development body, organization rather, for standards about 911. And I'm going to talk in a little bit towards the end. I'm going to talk about the NENA knowledge base, and most of the content in our slides today actually originated in the NENA knowledge base and is freely available to everybody. And as I mentioned at the end, I'll give you a URL there and you can go check it out for yourself. The development group is governed by a body called the Development Steering Council. It acts as a steering and alignment body for the development committees. Those committees are charged with managing specific work groups with focused charters on and instructions on what they should be doing. Down in the gold on the next few slides, you'll see examples, real life examples of whatever we're talking about on the slide. So in this particular case, I'm a co-chair of the GIS Data Transition Working Group, which, by the way, I'll drop a plug for. Just yesterday, we opened up our public review 2 comment period, and it will go through, I believe May 3rd was the date. So if you're a GIS practitioner or a 911 professional of any sort, please go check that out. Download that document in its draft form. Give us some good feedback in the public comment period. Well, what is a public comment period? We'll talk about that in just a few minutes as well. But that example of the GIS Data Transition Working Group, that working group is managed by the Data Structures and Management Committee, which is managed by the Development Steering Council. So that DSC plays an important role to just make sure that the standards, information documents, and reference documents that are being created are meeting the needs of the community of both vendors and professionals out there using software and equipment. So what does the process look like to create these documents? I purposefully left this graphic very illegible. It's a big, long graphic, and we're going to do our best to just kind of summarize it. This graphic also comes from the NENA knowledge base and is the official sort of flow chart of how things get done as far as document creation. Just to summarize it a bit, and even the summary is a lot of words, but there is a significant process here that occurs in order to create the NENA standards that we all depend on to do our job. It starts with an issue submission form, or an ISF, that is submitted via a process to the DSC, and feedback is sought from the NENA Development Group community at large on that, whether that's a legitimate issue that should be addressed. Upon approval, the DSC refers such an ISF to an appropriate committee. And so again, I'll use the example of my working group for GIS data transition document. Started with an ISF that was created by a couple folks that came together and said, you know, it'd be really good if there was a document that would help us understand how to make sure that our GIS data meets transition needs. That would be the needs between the legacy telephone databases, IMSAG, ALI, and others, and the GIS databases that we're creating for NextGen. At that time, there was already a working group that was putting together a document called GIS Data Stewardship Document that addressed how to get GIS data from any state into an in-state NG9-1 state of being. The gap there that the ISF revealed was, or called attention to, was that there is also transitional GIS data considerations that should be undertaken as well. So the DSC approved that, referred it to the data, at that time, the Data Management Committee. The Data Structure and Management Committee were recently merged. And that committee stood up and assigned the issue to a working group. So myself and my co-chairs, my fellow co-chairs, Jessica Fry and John Strebe, we've worked together with the DSC to create a charter that would give us our mission, right? The charter essentially defines the boundaries the working group should be working within, the topics that it should cover, the things that it should not cover as well. And as the working group evolves, sometimes these working groups evolve and there's something more to consider, something less to consider, and so that charter may need to be is considered a living document and may need to be edited at any point. Can be done so in concert with the DSC. And then the work began in that working group. That one bullet point there, work group drafts document and submits for style editing, took the GIS data transition working group about 3 years to do. So we had weekly meetings for the most part of 3 years, where we kind of considered all the things, wrote up all the text. We waited for a period of time for some other standards and documents to get finalized as to their guidance so that we would be sure that we didn't contradict any of them, and we considered all the changes that were ensuing in those documents as well. But that's what you think of if you participate in this process as what I think of as the work. At that time, when we had a draft that was ready for review, it went to what's called an all committee review, which is an internal review by anybody in the NENA development group. So we got some really good comments back. In fact, I would say there was a lot of value in the all committee review because we came out with a much better document because it got broad review from people that were GIS professionals working in the space and people that weren't, that were more concerned in their day-to-day with other technology things like telephony and networking and things like that. But they had really good questions that led us to create a better document for the GIS data transition document. And that is the value of all of these review periods and the comments and the adjudication process. As arduous as it is to receive comments, to change the document, and to document all of the adjudication of those comments, the end result is a much better document that serves its purpose even better than it did going into the review. At that time, we had a public review. This was last fall. We had our first public review after we adjudicated the all committee reviews comments, and received another handful of good feedback and comments from the public, and made some more improvements to the document. And now, actually, just yesterday was announced our public review too. So you notice that I refer to it as an iterative public review. Whenever there are substantive changes that occur based on a review comment, and when I say substantive, I mean not just editorial, but rather it changes the direction of the content, there must be another public review. The limitation to that second public review, however, is that all of the things that were previously reviewed and not commented on are off the table now. So only the changes that were based on the substantive changes that were based on a comment that we received in the first public review are open for review in the second round. Once we get back those comments, we're going to adjudicate them from public review 2, and we'll submit, once we receive final resolution on those, submit for a final approval from the DSC. Then a stable form notice will be issued. This is handled by the committee resource manager at NENA. Happens to be Sandy Dyer, who this webinar audience knows for sure. This stable form notice is an IPR and antitrust activity that I can't pretend to fully understand, but it is an opportunity for any person or company that has IP that's relevant to the content to declare that they have IP relevant to the content, so that there is no sort of future litigation or issue with the content of the document. And then finally, the NENA board approves all published documents, and then it's finally published. And some documents are ANSI standards. Obviously, we'll talk about the different document types here in a minute, but only a STA, a standard document would be ANSI approved. But if it is a standard and it is going to be ANSI approved, then it has to go through that ANSI process as well. So let's talk about the document types. The first I want to make reference to is requirements documents. Now, there are a couple of other types of documents that we're not going to talk about because they're mostly administrative or reference documents, but I want to focus in on the RAQ, the STA, and the INF document. So a NENA requirements document is published as an information source primarily for use by industry stakeholders, NENA committees, and NENA working groups as guides for their development of NENA standards. So it's important to note that a requirements document is not a standard. It's not considered a best practice. The content are derived from a combination of the express needs of the public safety agencies and the capabilities of the vendors of equipment and services. And requirements documents do not include standard methods, processes, or specifications needed to support interoperability among the various 911 system elements. So even though it's called a requirement document, it doesn't actually require anybody to do anything because it's not a standard. In fact, it is rather the requirements that need consideration as to whether or not they become a standard or they become best practice advice in an INF document. An example in the gold box below in 2022 was published NENA RAQ 003 3.1. The number past the decimal point shows the major version number, and the 2022 there indicates the year it was published. That is entitled 3D GIS, or my short title for it is 3D GIS for E9-1 and NG9-1. So you're trying to wrap your head around kind of the future of 3D GIS requirements for 911. It's a great document that shows, as stated in that second bullet, the needs of the public safety agencies and the capabilities of vendors and equipment and services. So that's an RAQ. There's not a whole lot of RAQs out there, particularly there's not a whole lot of RAQs that are relevant to GIS, but this one is a great example, RAQ 003. You may hear people in NENA circles abbreviate the document number, or if you're initiated enough to remember what the document numbers are, you may hear people talk about RAQ 003, STA 05, STA 06, etc., etc. Next document type is the standard document, the STA. It's published for use of the public safety community and is intended to describe methods, processes, and specifications that, if implemented as specified, should result in successful operation of the 911 emergency call and incident processing system and promote interoperability between interconnected systems. The words here are really important. So I don't typically read slides to my audience, but the words here are really important. So I want to make sure that I get the right words. So I'm just reading that bullet point to you. This is really the hefty part of the NENA's mission, the NENA Development Group's mission, is to create these standards. Some NENA standard documents may be published as American National Standards, which are accredited by the American National Standard Institute, or ANSI. The thing to note about a standard is that, just as the words say, it describes methods, processes, and specifications that will lead to interoperability, right? So the word standard also implies that everybody everywhere that meets this standard will do the same things the same way. And so it's important to note about a standard document is that what it really describes is what needs to be accomplished, not how it needs to be accomplished. And so it's an important note about a standard that while it will definitely lead to much more uniform practices and procedures in the how of what gets done, but there will be occasions, there will be many examples where, let's take NextGen core services for an example. There may be a selection of 5 or 6 NextGen core service providers out there that are providing an ECRF and an LVF as described in STA 010. But how those ECRFs and LVFs work is really up to those NGCS core, those NextGen core service providers, as long as they meet the methods, processes, and specifications that are contained in STA 010. So you may have, in some cases, some variations or peculiarities about how you may need to configure your GIS data based on how a particular NextGen core service provider provides the ECRF and LVF, how that software interprets the data that is standardized and consumed. So you may have 5 or 6 different providers with 5 or 6 different products that actually operate in 5 or 6 different ways, but are still all standard compliant. So that's an important note to make about standard, is that it provides a lot of uniform products, but it doesn't necessarily mean that every product on the marketplace has to work the same way in order to be standard compliant. I hope that makes sense to everybody. Down in the gold box below, an example, STA 006, the famous NG9-1 GIS data model that probably most of you on this webinar know and love. Its document number, NENA STA 006.2A, the letter there indicating that there has been an errata version published in 2022. Errata versions are published where there are editorial changes that got slipped through the process on the first way through and got changed in the errata version. Thirdly, I want to talk about the INF, or information documents. They're published to distribute information on particular subjects to the public safety community. They may contain background information, best practices, checklists, and other materials representing the collective knowledge and experiences of the NENA community. They may contain conditional normative statements to promote compliance with published NENA standards, but are not intended to be used to establish conformance requirements in development or procurement process purposes. I think of the INF documents out there as, here's the best practice advice to be conformant with standard documents. So in the case of the GIS data stewardship document, as you see there in the gold box below, the intention of the document was to be written to an audience that would be readers that are generally GIS practitioners that may or may not have a lot of 911 specific exposure, but still need to configure their GIS data in a way that is conformant to the previously referenced STA 060, the GIS data model, for instance. And it particularly focuses on, the GIS data stewardship particularly focuses on how the best practices would call for you to get existing GIS data that was not built for NG9-1 purposes into standard compliant format. And for instance, the INF that in the working group that I co-chaired, the GIS data transition work group, focused on that same audience with that same data, but focused on those transitional elements of the data. And what we tried to explain was all of the legacy routing elements, such as IMSAG, ALI, SRDB, etc., and the background of that, and the background and intention of the NG9-1 elements, such as ECRF, LVF, and SI, and help the reader understand the things that they need to understand so that they can configure the legacy fields of the GIS data and any other sort of way that they can connect and synchronize, if you will, the GIS data with those legacy databases. So think of an INF as a best practice document that gives advice, generally acceptable advice on how to be conformant to the standards. These documents have a particular way they're called, right? The identification reference, it calls out the fact that it's a NENA and then tells what type of document, REQ, STA, INF, and then the standard number, the information document number, the document number 006 in this case, and a standard title, NENA standard for NG9-1 GIS data model. Again, as an example of the published GIS data stewardship document. So we kind of, in the community, we refer to it as GIS data stewardship, but the official title is NENA information document for GIS data stewardship for NextGen 9-1. You may also hear us within the community refer to it as INF 028 because of the way the document is numbered. There's also a lot to be observed, and this is really only in reference to my area of expertise, which is the GIS angle. But it's infinitely more applicable and infinitely more interdependent as you bring your zoom level off of just GIS and into the broader world of NENA standards information documents, requirement documents, is that there is document interdependency, and we'll just use the GIS data model as an example. And I have to pause for a second and acknowledge that the idea for this graphic and the ones that follow here in the next slide or so originate with Richard Kelly over at Motorola Solutions. But when he explains it this way, it made so much sense and so much clarity. I reached out to him and I let him know that I was going to use the same messaging to kind of share with this webinar and really adopt it in general. And he was thrilled at that idea. And I think if we were all to understand this as clearly as Richard explains it, then we'll understand our jobs and what we need to do. But let's take NG9-1 GIS data model as an example. That's style 006 as you see below. There is interdependency among all of these documents, right? So that GIS data model is cited in every one of the INFs. Utilization of GIS data in GCS is being drafted now by a working group that I'm a part of. The CLDXF Canada, the CLDXF US, the 3D GIS requirements, and the I3 architecture itself all cite passages, and not to leave out GIS data stewardship or location validation and consistency. They all cite passages from the NG9-1 GIS data model because they, instead of explaining the same thing a different way, they rely on the explanation given in the standard for the GIS data model. And I know that as the co-chair of the GIS data transition document, we heavily cited the data model, we heavily cited GIS data stewardship, we heavily cited CLDXF, and so on. And so each one of these documents has interdependencies on all the other documents. So they are a completely related network of documents. That is why that role of the DSC, the steering committee, is critical to be sure that there is no duplication of effort between these documents and that we're not wasting time saying the same thing different ways between these documents. I like Richard's his metaphor of a train as well, and you've probably been seeing him talk about it in different ways. In fact, I'm this week at the National States Geographic Information Council meeting in Washington, D.C., and Richard gave an update as the NENA liaison to that group and shared this with them as well. This train, the idea of these things being hooked together as a train cars are hooked together, that the STAL 010 I3 architecture is then dependent on and has a relationship to STAL 004, the CLDXF. That is the US, but that will also be a Canada CLDXF that it's dependent on as well, that rolls down to the 3D requirements, for instance, and into the data model. And then the best practices pulling up the caboose of the train, if you will, that tell practitioners, give practitioners best practice advice on how to take the standards and take your GIS data in this particular instance and bring it to conformance with all of the standards that I just mentioned. So I really like this idea of making the interdependencies of each one of these documents clear in thinking of it in the train analogy. And I hope that makes sense. And so what you see here in this listing is each of the documents that have been published and kind of where they're at now, GIS relevant documents that are going through version changes in working groups that are published and stable, right? So the I3 standard STAL 010 is going through a well, I hesitate to call it an upgrade, right? But they're bringing along to the next version, which will be version 3.0, 3.1. 3.0 is the current published version. There are going to be things that are relevant to GIS practitioners that are going to be changes in STA-010 in version 3.1. For instance, one of them is the Appendix B, which describes the requirements for the spatial interface, moves into the STA-006, the GIS data model, which is in development of a V3 now. And I just want to make a note here that 3D location data requirement should be REQ 003, but I've called it 002 there for some reason. So please observe that. The GIS data stewardship for NG9-1 was a massive effort with dozens and dozens of people in 2 or 3 different working groups to put together this really great information document that gives best practices about how to develop GIS data for NG9-1 to make it compliant with STA-006 above. That is in a steady V2. I fully anticipate that at some point in the next year or so, I don't know what the right crystal ball date would be, but I would say in the next year or so, there are going to be some developments that will require that working group to come back together and update based on the changes that are being developed in V3 of STA-006, as well as V3.1 of STA-010. As I mentioned before, the GIS data transition document, INF 046, is out for public review too. Again, I just want to encourage everybody to go out there and read that document, take a look, ask questions, make comments, and help us improve the document. And then another working group that I'm involved with is taking what used to be a standard, STA-005, that was called Provisioning and Maintenance of GIS Data for ECRFs and LVFs, is actually deprecating that STA-005 document and turning instead the concepts in it into an INF, an information document about the utilization of GIS and NGCS. Now that working group is in the throes of development activities now, and it would be a great opportunity, a great target if you're a GIS professional trying to understand how GIS data gets used in NextGen core services, or if you're in the NextGen core service arena, either as a consumer or a producer. Now's the time to give your input to those best practices, as well as an opportunity, if you don't know a lot about it, to learn just by participating in the process. That one is in development now. I would anticipate kind of an all committee review or a public review process to go down on it probably later this year at some point. I'm just a participant of that, though, not a co-chair, so take that with a grain of salt. But that's going to be a great document, very useful to our community once it gets published. So a little bit of advice about how to use the documents. And again, we went all the way back to the foundation here on how these documents are produced and what the documents are and what they're intended to do, so that we can begin to consider the impact of these standards and information documents on your day-to-day workflows and life in your job. So I want to take the example of a GIS practitioner that's out there that sets about without a lot of experience in 9-1 to create GIS data for NG9-1. And somebody says to them one day, oh, well, you could just take a look at STA-010. It's the I3 architecture. It's how your GIS data will be used, or the functional elements that are defined in it will be using your GIS data. And through their persistent research, they get into that document and their mind is just kind of like blown and dulled by the fact that this is a document written by technologists for technologists and not really about GIS data at all. And it's kind of difficult on your own to extract the lessons that you need to understand about it to do the job of creating GIS data for NG9-1. So you may come through some reference in that document to the CLDXF, the Civic Location Data Exchange format, that is the conveyance format for location across NG9-1 systems. And in there, you'll find some really helpful examples. That's one of the best things about being from a GIS professional's perspective about STAL 004. It's full of tables of wonderful examples that go, oh, okay, now I start to be seeing how I can parse my data differently, how I can configure the attributes, what I need to be concerned about as it relates to the location data fields that are in that GIS data. You may also come to know about the GIS data model. Most GIS professionals that don't have a lot of experience in this just go, just tell me what format you need it in and I'll make it. Just give me the schema. And they'll look at the GIS data model and they'll think, oh, okay, here's my schema, right? But there has to be a thoughtful interpretation of that schema, all of the information contained in that GIS data model, standards, STAL 006. A thoughtful interpretation has to be made about all of it. It all has to be done in context of all the other documents, which you may be, kind of searching for, like, I need help connecting the dots, right? I see a lot of dots, but I don't understand how they fully connect. Inner information document, GIS data, about GIS data stewardship, INF 028. It kind of should help you turn on the lights. Like, oh, okay, I see now there's dots among STAL 10, among STAL 004, among STAL 006, just as a couple of examples that are connected because I read through this information document, INF 028, about GIS data stewardship. That's the intention of it. So a little bit of advice, a little bit of a recommendation on my part, that if you're new to the scene or you're struggling to connect the dots, new or otherwise, the way that I would recommend you approach these documents is to start with the INF where it's available. The great news is for GIS professionals, there is the GIS data stewardship document published, and that shortly, maybe in the summer, optimistically, the GIS data transition document will also be published, and there will be good insights, best practices, and community derive general advice on how to connect the dots between these standards and create good GIS data for NG9-1-1. That'll also be followed on by the publishing at some point of the utilization of GIS data in NGCS information document as well. So just a recommendation there, a little bit of advice on how I would suggest anybody go about attempting to do that. So I'm going to stop there in terms of content about the NENA standards, but I want to introduce you to the NENA knowledge base. There's the URL for the NENA knowledge base. If you wonder, if you hear anybody talking in the community about, an SI and an ECRF and all of the alphabet soup that's out there, and you wonder what in the world is that SI thing, or what is an SDPI? If it's part of an approved standard, if it's part of an approved and published INF document, the definitions and terms are all available on the NENA knowledge base. There's also great articles about the process of the document creation that we talked about in our slides today, as well as other general 911 concepts. It's a really great place if you're a GIS professional. You don't have a lot of operational experience that is sitting in a dispatch or comm center and dispatching 911 calls. There's a lot of great operational standards out there that we don't talk about on this webinar, but that are really relevant to the people who are doing the job day in and day out. And NENA knowledge base will help you ask questions and find out and learn more about operational concepts as well. So I just want to leave here, and we'll pick up some Q&A here in just a second. Looks like we'll have about 15 minutes or so to do some Q&A. But I want to leave with a plug for joining the effort at NENA, right? Do your best to learn more at the NENA knowledge base. Attend a conference such as the NG9-1-1 Standards and Best Practices, or SBP conference, one of my favorite conferences of the cycle. Always educational, really good to learn things there. So I can't recommend that enough. And then finally, the QR code here is where you can sign up to join a NENA working group. And there's actually dozens and dozens of them that you can join. They're a great way to learn, and they're definitely a great way to contribute your experience and knowledge to the community. So Let's check. Stephanie, do we have any good Q&As that we should start with here? Let me take a look at the chat.
So we really just had Shauna come in and ask for links to the documents that you were referencing, Jeff. So I think what we'll do is include the links to all of those in the follow-up email to this. And Shauna, I'll go ahead and reach out to you and provide those to you directly as well.
Great. Yeah, and I see Michael Hirschman asks, how does one get involved in this? Great question. Just scan that QR code and go sign up for a working group. I would recommend, if you're a GIS professional, sign up for the data stewardship working group. Even though they're not active now, when they spin back up, they'll be considering some things that'll be relevant. And that utilization of GIS data and NGCS, that NextGen core service group, is a great one.
I think also another thing that we had talked about before is that there are a million different ways that we could take these NENA presentations. I know, Jeff, we had kind of talked about a couple of other topics. So if anybody here is interested in learning more about a specific topic from any of the NENA documents that we reference, we'd be happy to present on those as well. So you guys can let us know about that in the chat too.
Yeah, that'd be really great. You know, some good feedback from you guys on what kind of content would be good as it relates to NENA standards or best practices, as it relates to our experience applying those standards and best practices, would help us give you even more value in this webinar series. Well, I hope this has been a good foundational presentation. And as I said, and I think Stephanie said as well, we're going to build on this foundation about how standards and information documents are built, with future webinars about the contents of some of those standards and information documents. They are replete with golden nuggets of good stuff for GIS professionals, and we're going to go through some of those in detail and relay some of the recommendations, best practices, and some of those information documents on future webinars. So I recommend everybody watch out for those in the future, and I appreciate everybody's time and attention today.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next month.